What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now!
Welcome to Real Democracy Now. I'm Nivek Thompson, and Real Democracy Now is a podcast for people who think we can and should improve how democracy works. This podcast looks at democracy from different angles to help you think about how democracy might be improved. Welcome to episode 8 of Real Democracy Now, a podcast. Today I'm talking to Professor Archon Fung. Professor Fung is the Ford Foundation Professor of Democracy and Citizenship in the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. His research explores policies, practices, and institutional designs that deepen the quality of democratic governance. He focuses upon public participation, deliberation, and transparency. He co-directs the Transparency Policy Project and leads democratic governance programs at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at the Kennedy School. Today, Professor Fung talks about the concept of pragmatic democracy, which he describes as being focused on what outcomes we want to achieve, and then looking at different models to determine which ones will get us closer to those outcomes. In some ways, this approach is similar to the problem-based approach described by Professor Warren in the last episode. Archon also expands on his article, Our Desperate Need to Save US Democracy from Ourselves. Thank you so much for joining me today, Archon. I'd like to kick off with asking you about your concept of pragmatic democracy. What is pragmatic democracy, and how does it relate to representative democracy?
Thank you very much for having me on this show, and I really look forward to our discussion. I think the challenges to democracy right now in the contemporary West are larger than in many decades past, and so I think it's time for continuing the good and deep and probing discussion about fundamental challenges to democracy and what might help out with them. My notion of pragmatic democracy stems from ideas that John Dewey developed many years ago in many of his writings, and in particular, The Public and Its Problems. And by pragmatism, I don't mean a kind of, kind of everyday, let's get it done as easily as we can without regard to principle. What I do mean is that citizens and public leaders and political parties and organizations should be open-minded with regard to how they try to solve the problems that they face in contemporary society and economy. So let me give you a contrast with what pragmatic democracy argues against. So in political life right now, different sides have a tendency, especially in some of the more polarized social and political contexts, to really dig in on their fundamental principles and to reject policies or political opponents that depart from those principles. And what pragmatism says, or pragmatic democracy says, or at least my version of it, is that you should relax the principles a little bit and be really attentive to what the problems are that you face and what will actually solve those problems. And so let me try to think of an example here. So if one example that's large on many university campuses is the issue of free speech. And in the University of California at Berkeley and in Middlebury College, there's been a lot of conflicts over controversial speakers, particularly conservative speakers, that some activist students object to, right? And so then you kind of have a pretty polarized debate on one side where people say, well, anybody should be able to speak. A university is about freedom of expression. And another side that feels that some of these speakers are fundamental threats to their dignity, that advocate positions that threaten their fundamental rights. And so you have kind of a trade-off there. And so should those organizations be for free speech at any price, or should the priority be on creating safe spaces for certain populations that are vulnerable and have been historically disadvantaged? That's how the policy debate plays out. I think what both sides, or at least some of both sides, some members of both of those camps are really after, is an environment, a university environment in which everyone can learn and flourish. And then the real debate is about, well, what is the best way to help people to create that environment in which people can learn and flourish? And so that may involve all sorts of other measures, like allowing controversial speakers, but constructing the ground rules in particular ways so that there has to be a robust exchange or other points of view permitted, or ground rules of communication so that insults and ad hominem attacks don't fly back and forth rather than a simple kind of black and white position. And so the pragmatist would say, okay, well, you begin by thinking freedom of expression is what you want, and the value that you have behind freedom of expression is learning and pursuit of the truth. But when you have really completely unregulated expression that includes forms of insults and hate speech and a shutting down, that the measure that you thought might achieve your end doesn't really achieve it. And so then the pragmatist says, okay, well, you have to go back a little bit and think, okay, what really will achieve this end that I want, which is the pursuit of truth and an open exchange. So that's how pragmatism works at the policy level. I think you're concerned also with the institutional level of representative democracy. And so pragmatic democracy also works at the institutional level. So I do a lot of work on participatory democracy. And when I did this work earlier in my career, 15 or 20 years ago, I would talk to elected officials about direct citizen participation and how it was important for ordinary citizens to participate in politics in all kinds of ways beyond the ballot box. And very, very frequently, I would get the answer that, well, I really disagree with you, Professor, because they elected me and their participation in politics ought to be limited to elections. And then my job is to make law and policy after that. So what's the need for participation beyond the voting stage, right? And there you have kind of a conflict, a difference in view, with some people thinking, well, representative democracy is the right set of institutions. And then another set of people thinking, well, no, representative democracy is not enough. We ought to have direct democracy and more citizen participation. And the pragmatist says, or the pragmatic democratic approach says, well, maybe you shouldn't be so dogmatic about which institution you want. Maybe you should think about what kinds of outcomes are desirable for a democracy to have, and then say, okay, well, is participatory democracy going to get us closer to that? Or is representative democracy going to get us closer to that? And in a more nuanced way, what mix of participation and representation is likely to get us to the kind of democracy that we want? And so let me give you another example just to flesh that out a little bit. What representative democracy is the idea that we elect representatives and they make laws and policies, and then we have another round of elections. But I believe that there are certain laws and policies that representatives should not make. In particular, in the United States, in a lot of places, in a lot of states, legislators make decisions, laws and policies that regulate the rules of the political game, like redistricting rules and so on. And I'm kind of presume your readers know a little bit about the redistricting debate. The problem there is that when elected officials make policies that govern the rules of how they get elected, like where the electoral district lines lie, they have a strong, strong temptation to make rules of the game that make it more likely that they'll stay in office. And I don't regard that as a very democratic objective. Rather, the democratic objective is to have rules of the game that give citizens choice among different representatives, that create reasonable ties between citizens and their elected officials, and enable citizens to hold elected officials accountable, right? And then so if what I say is true, that when elected officials get to make decisions about rules of the game like redistricting, they are likely to make rules that aren't very favorable from the democratic point of view, then the pragmatist says, okay, well, don't just stick to this idea of representative democracy. When you run into a failing like that, think about what other ways of governing might get you to better rules of the political game. And then so the pragmatist might say, okay, well, let's look at other alternatives. Should judges do it? Should a computer do it? Should mathematicians do it? Or should ordinary citizens do it? And I'm very attracted to exploring a set, methods in which ordinary citizens, like juries, are invited to participate in making the rules of the game. And we have a pretty good example of that in California with the California Citizens Redistricting Commission.
What I find interesting is the way you're using pragmatic. It seems to be you're really saying, look at the underlying values, what you're trying to achieve, as a way of making a decision about what direction you should take on policy or practice. And yet the usual use of the word pragmatic in other contexts would make people think of something which really is a bit more sort of instrumental and less value-based. Am I getting that right?
Yes. So pragmatism for me, and this comes straight from Dewey and the early American pragmatists, is the idea that we're always learning and that no real prior commitment to principle or values can really completely survive the encounter with reality. That actually trying to achieve the ends that you begin with kind of changes what you want after you try to accomplish it. And so the most simple kind of illustration comes from this old, very old debate in early 20th century psychology about stimulus and response versus learning. And so Dewey has this essay about the reflex arc, in which you imagine a child, a baby even, who's very attracted, who wants to be interested. So babies are attracted to shiny things like mirrors and like even flame, right? And so, but when a baby tries to reach out and touch flame, it's hot and they pull back. And if you don't have a kind of pragmatic view, then you think, oh, well, all that's happening is a stimulus, the burning, and then the response, the pulling back. But the pragmatist says, well, no, what the second round is really learning that when you, at first, your value or the objective that you're seeking is to become engaged and to discover things. So you reach out for these bright, shiny things. You do that once and you realize that some bright, shiny things are actually dangerous and painful. And so you learn and you say, okay, well, I'm not interested in all bright, shiny things, only some of them that turn out to be interesting. And so that's an example in early childhood that projects up, at least for Dewey and for my kind of pragmatic rearticulation of it, at these much larger levels for societies and for institutions, for political parties and leaders as well.
Yeah, I haven't ever thought of it that way. Thanks. So in December 2016, you wrote an article titled Our Desperate Need to Save US Democracy from Ourselves. And with all the things that have been happening in the world from before then and since, looking at the US presidency, the Turkish referendum, what's happening in Europe with the French elections and beyond, do you believe representative democracy can be saved? And if so, what needs to change?
I definitely believe representative democracy can be saved. I'm an optimist in that regard. I do think that it's a little bit on the ropes right now for the reasons and the examples that you point out. And I wrote the piece as a little bit of an exploration to try to draw attention to the ways in which we're all not doing our part for democracy, and for representative democracy as well as for other kinds of democracy. And what do I mean by that? I mean that the analogy in the paper is to global climate change or to other kinds of public goods. And for climate, we know that we all take self-interested actions like driving too much or littering or using more water than we should or using water bottles instead of filters that end up producing pollution and increasing our carbon footprint in ways that degrade the environment in the long term. And we know, I think many people acknowledge that we need to limit a little bit the pursuit of our own immediate self-interest if we want to have a sustainable ecological future. But I think in the democratic case, we don't think of democracy that way. We think of democratic institutions, once somebody's written a constitution, as incredibly robust rules, and we can do whatever we want in the pursuit of our political objectives, and democracy will be fine. And I don't think that that's the case. And so the paper is an exploration of how different kinds of political actors and citizens need to do more for the sake of democracy, and how doing that requires them to limit their own self-interest. So at the level of the citizen, I think most of your listeners will agree, democracy is in trouble when citizens stop participating altogether. When no one votes, then representative democracy is in quite a bit of trouble. In Australia, you've taken care of that a little bit with mandatory voting, and so your voting rates are very high. In the United States, our voting rates are quite low, and there's many reasons for that. But the United States in presidential turnout is something like 31 out of 35, and among mature democratic countries. So it's a lot easier for citizens to stay home on election day. Maybe there are long lines. Maybe they get busy and have to take their kids to school. But it hurts democracy when they do that. They need to give a little more to it. Another citizen example is that right now, many societies are very polarized. In the United States, many people live in communities where people have similar political views to their own. In cities, it's oftentimes Democrats, and smaller towns and in the middle of the country, many of these communities are much more predominantly Republican. And even on the internet, in our internet news consumption habits, we tend to read things that reinforce our political views rather than challenge them. And that's a very natural and strong psychological tendency. We seek out things that reinforce our views and find things that challenge our views unpleasant. But if a robust democracy is to work, I think citizens need to encounter people who have different views from their own, and encounter and read things that advocate for positions that challenge their own. But that's psychologically painful. And another way in which democracy requires citizens to be to do things that are a little bit against their short-term self-interest. I believe that democracy would be much better off if citizens went out of their way to encounter and engage with views that are different from their own, and other citizens whose views are different from their own. At the political level, it's a much bigger picture, right? Much bigger kind of scale of problem. So I went to a meeting of the campaign directors of the presidential Republican and Democratic campaigns after the 2012 election. And both sides were very proud of their digital strategies. And in particular, they were very pleased that they had developed data and methods and algorithms that allowed them to target very small segments of the population and deliver messages to reinforce support for their candidate or to mobilize them. And I asked them a question. I said, well, these methods may be very, very good for your candidate, but I'm afraid that they might be bad for democracy, because democracy at election time should involve a big conversation among many different kinds of citizens, talking about the big issues to one another through their candidates and in other ways. And the response I found was very, very interesting. And the response was, well, Professor, you may be very right about that. You may be completely correct. But my job is not to help American democracy. My job is to help my guy win, right? Which, from one perspective, is quite right. So they might regard it, their employer might regard it as a dereliction of duty. But that situation is not good for American democracy when the very actors, the leaders and their organizations regard it as their primary, maybe only responsibility to win the election rather than to do things that are beneficial for democracy. And then so another part of my thinking in this regard goes to the responsibility of politicians. And I do believe that politicians have an obligation to constrain the pursuit of their self-interest for the sake of the health of democracy sometime. So I don't know if you remember, in 2008, then candidate Obama had pledged to abide by the public financing rules so long as his opponent did also. And then shortly thereafter, he found out he was a very, very good fundraiser and said, well, I don't know whether the other candidate is going to abide by public financing or not, but I'm not going to anymore. And so he weakened the norm that candidates should accept public financing and that money in politics is a corrosive force in politics by abandoning the public financing system. And so I regard that as in his self-interest, and he eventually won the election, but bad for democracy.
Yeah, look, I don't remember that particular example, but it's a very interesting one. Can I just ask a follow-on question? You gave an example, or you linked your argument around representative democracy and looking at individual actions and how they can contribute to global warming, and you linked that sort of idea of self-interest and so on, limiting self-interest. I have seen things which suggest that a lot of the focus in the global warming, in the climate debate, is on what citizens can do, and yet the reality is that so much of the actual activities in the world that have a huge impact on the climate are actually those done by institutions, by governments, by large businesses. And I wonder if you see a similar situation here, that there is a contribution individual citizens can make, but that perhaps it's not actually as large a contribution as some of the key institutions of democracy.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. The contributions of large institutions of democracy are very, very important. And so the political example that I just gave of Obama and the political parties is absolutely key. Unless they constrain the pursuit of their own self-interest and agree to rules of the road that all political actors constrain their self-interest, then democracy is in trouble. Another large institutional actor that's critical for every modern democracy is the media. And the media are a very interesting example. For most of the post-war 20th century, at least in the United States and in other places too, I think we as democratic societies benefited from mass media that had, in part, a little bit of a democratic ethos, in that many, many journalists saw it as part of their responsibility to get the story right, to create an informed citizenry, to tell both sides of the story, and to hold power accountable to truth. That's what many journalists, you think about Woodward and Bernstein reporting on Watergate. That's how they see part of their jobs, at least in the ideal. They had that ethos, right? And in much of the 20th century, we benefited from an economic structure in which mass media were financed by advertising that employed a bunch of these journalists with some journalistic ethics that benefited democracy, right? And so that's kind of a happy story in which we benefit from this big institution with a lot of professionals, these journalists, who are doing things to help create the kind of information that democracy needs, right? And now in the early part of the 21st century, as you know, major media organizations are in trouble, in large part because all of that advertising money has moved to internet companies like Facebook and Google and Twitter and many others, right? And the absence there from a democratic point of view is that it's early days, but it's my belief and I would love to be shown that I'm wrong in this belief, that those media organizations, unlike the 20th century media organizations, don't have any thick democratic ethics or even see strengthening democracy as an important part of what they do and how they should guide the design of their algorithms and platforms and businesses. And indeed, I think many would reject the idea that they need to limit the pursuit of profit for the sake of designing their new media in ways that make democracy more healthy. And so I think there's a real lacuna there. And to go to your point about large institutions, just like global warming, large institutions are critical to the health of democracy. New media organizations provide the information, good information or bad information that citizens need. They create the social and sometimes political relationships that drive democratic decision making. And so I think it's absolutely critical that they reorganize in ways that are good for democracy rather than bad for democracy. Otherwise, democracy is in trouble.
Thanks for that. I'm actually going to look at media as a key player, as you've just said, in Season 3, when I'm going to be looking at elections, voting and alternatives. We'll be hearing again from Professor Fung later in this season when I pull together different perspectives on democracy and capitalism, as well as in Season 4, which is looking at between-election democracy, where his work on empowered participation is particularly relevant. In next week's episode, I speak with Associate Professor Sophia Nastrom about her theoretical work developing the concept of the spirit of democracy. I hope you'll join me then. Thanks for listening to Real Democracy Now! You can find more about today's topic in the show notes at www.realdemocracynow.com.au. If you enjoyed this program, please subscribe to this podcast, write a review, share the podcast with your friends, and join the conversation on the webpage or on Facebook or Twitter. I'd love to know what you think is the essence of a real democracy.